The morning sun cast long shadows across Fort Benning's training grounds as recruits stumbled out of their barracks, still rubbing sleep from their eyes. Among them walked Sarah Martinez, her small frame almost lost in the oversized military fatigues that hung loosely on her petite build. At barely 5 feet 2 inches tall and weighing just over 100 pounds, she looked more like someone's little sister who had accidentally wandered onto a military base than a serious recruit. The other trainees had noticed her immediately when she arrived 3 weeks ago. While most of them stood tall and muscular, Sarah appeared fragile, almost breakable. Her dark hair was pulled back in regulation style, but even that couldn't hide the youthful features that made her look younger than her 22 years. The male recruits towered over her, and even the female soldiers seemed to dwarf her presence. "Look who's still here," muttered Jake Thompson, a former college football player whose biceps strained against his uniform sleeves. He nudged his buddy Mike Davis, pointing in Sarah's direction. "I'm surprised she hasn't packed up and gone home to mommy yet." Mike chuckled, adjusting his own imposing 6-foot frame. "Give her time. Today's the obstacle course. I bet she'll be crying by lunch." The comments weren't new to Sarah. She had heard variations of them every single day since her arrival. The snickers behind her back, the whispered jokes about how she must have gotten lost on her way to a summer camp, the betting pools on how long she would last. Some recruits openly questioned how she had even passed the initial fitness requirements to get into the program. What they didn't know, what none of them bothered to ask about, was the small patch sewn discreetly on the inside of her jacket. A patch that told a story none of them could imagine. A patch that represented years of training, sacrifice, and experiences that would make most of these recruits wake up in cold sweats. Drill Sergeant Morrison's voice boomed across the training area like thunder rolling across the Georgia hills. "All right, listen up, maggots. Today we're running the full obstacle course. This isn't some playground equipment you'll be playing on. This course has broken bones, ended careers, and sent more than a few soldiers packing their bags for home." He paced in front of the assembled group like a caged predator, his weathered face scanning each recruit with the intensity of a hawk searching for prey. Morrison had been in the Army for over 20 years, had served in 3 combat deployments, and had trained thousands of soldiers. He knew how to spot weakness, and he knew how to exploit it to make soldiers stronger. The course starts with the rope climb, followed by the mud crawl under barbed wire, then the wall climb, tire run, and finishes with the confidence course. You will complete this course in under 12 minutes, or you will run it again. And again. And again until you either make time or collapse trying. Sarah stood at attention with the rest of the group, but she could feel the eyes on her. The sideways glances, the smirks, the whispered comments that weren't quite quiet enough. She had developed thick skin over the years, but it still stung. Especially when she knew that most of these people judging her had never faced real danger, had never been tested under actual fire. "Martinez." Morrison's voice cut through her thoughts like a blade. "You're up first." A collective murmur rippled through the group. First was usually reserved for either the strongest recruit to set an example, or the weakest to get their inevitable failure out of the way. Given the sergeant's tone and the looks from her fellow trainees, Sarah knew which category she had been placed in. She stepped forward, her boots splashing slightly in the muddy ground that had been churned up by hundreds of previous training exercises. The obstacle course stretched out before her like a medieval gauntlet designed to test every aspect of physical and mental strength. The rope hung 30 feet in the air, wet from the morning dew and looking impossibly high. The barbed wire section stretched for 50 yards, with barely enough clearance for a grown person to crawl through without getting shredded. "This should be entertaining," Jake whispered to Mike, not bothering to lower his voice. $20 says she doesn't make it past the rope." "You're on," Mike replied. "I say she quits before she even starts climbing." Sarah positioned herself at the starting line, her hands flexing unconsciously as she prepared for what was coming. She could feel the weight of expectation, the assumption of failure that pressed down on her shoulders like a physical force. Behind her, she heard someone actually laugh. "Remember, Martinez," Morrison called out, his voice carrying clearly across the field. 12 minutes. Clock starts on my whistle. She closed her eyes for just a moment, centering herself the way she had been taught years ago in a very different kind of training program. When she opened them again, something had changed in her posture, in the set of her shoulders. It was subtle, barely noticeable, but, suddenly, she didn't look quite so small anymore. The whistle pierced the morning air. Sarah exploded forward with a speed that caught everyone off guard. Her legs, which had looked so thin and weak in comparison to the others, pumped with mechanical precision as she sprinted toward the rope. There was no hesitation, no pause to gather courage. She hit the rope at full speed and began climbing with a fluid motion that spoke of countless hours of practice. Her technique was flawless. While most recruits struggled and fought against the rope, burning energy with inefficient movements, Sarah moved up it like she was walking up a flight of stairs. Hand over hand, legs wrapped around the rope for support, breathing controlled and steady. The watching crowd fell silent as they watched the small woman who they had been mocking ascend the 30-foot rope faster than any of them had ever seen. At the top, she didn't pause to catch her breath or celebrate reaching the summit. She simply tapped the bell that marked the completion of the rope climb and rappelled down with the same mechanical efficiency that had carried her up. "What the hell?" Jake muttered, his confident smirk beginning to fade. But Sarah wasn't finished. She hit the ground running, literally transitioning from the rope descent directly into a sprint toward the barbed wire section. This was where most recruits slowed down, where the fear of getting cut and the awkwardness of crawling through mud typically broke their momentum. Sarah dropped into the crawl position and began moving through the obstacle like water flowing downhill. Her small frame, which had been such a source of ridicule, suddenly became an advantage. She could navigate spaces that would snag larger recruits, could maintain speed where others had to slow down to avoid injury. The mud was thick and cold, designed to make the crawl miserable and exhausting. It was supposed to sap strength and break spirits. But Sarah moved through it with the same relentless efficiency she had shown on the rope. Her elbows and knees found purchase where others would slip, her low profile allowing her to maintain momentum where others got hung up on the wire. Watching from the sideline, Morrison's expression had completely changed. The condescending smirk was gone, replaced by something closer to professional interest. He had seen thousands of recruits attempt this course, and he knew what good looked like. This wasn't just good. This was exceptional. Sarah emerged from the barbed wire section covered in mud but moving like a machine. The wall climb was next, a 12-foot wooden barrier that required upper body strength and technique to overcome. Most recruits struggled with this obstacle, especially after the exhaustion of the rope and crawl. She approached the wall at a dead run, planted her foot against the base, and used her momentum to help propel herself upward. Her arms, which had looked so thin and weak, pulled her body up and over the wall with an economy of movement that spoke of extensive training. She was over and down the other side before most people could fully process what they had seen. The tire run should have been where her small stature worked against her. 20 heavy tires laid out in a zigzag pattern, requiring recruits to step in and out of each one while maintaining speed. The tires were set for average-sized soldiers, meaning Sarah had to work harder to maintain her pace. But she had adapted. Instead of the high-stepping motion most recruits used, she developed a rhythm that worked with her shorter legs, using quick, precise steps that maintained her forward momentum without wasting energy on unnecessary vertical movement. She flowed through the tire section like a dancer, each step perfectly placed, each movement contributing to her overall speed. The final obstacle was the confidence course, a series of elevated platforms, balance beams, and rope swings that tested coordination and nerve as much as physical ability. This was where mental strength mattered as much as physical capability, or fear could paralyze even the strongest recruit. Sarah attacked the confidence course with the same relentless efficiency she had shown throughout the run. Balance beam crossed in seconds, rope swing executed perfectly, final platform reached and conquered. She dropped down from the last obstacle and sprinted across the finish line. Morrison clicked his stopwatch and stared at the display for a long moment. Then, he looked up at Sarah, who was breathing hard but still standing strong, covered in mud and sweat but with her head held high. 8 minutes, 37 seconds, he announced to the stunned group of recruits. The silence that followed was profound. 8 minutes 37 seconds wasn't just a good time. It wasn't just a passing grade. It was a time that would have been competitive in advanced training courses, the kind of performance you expected from seasoned soldiers with years of experience. Jake and Mike stood with their mouths hanging open. The bet they had made suddenly seemed absurd. This wasn't the weak, fragile girl they had been mocking. This was someone who had just demonstrated a level of physical capability that exceeded anything they had achieved. But it was more than just the time. It was the way she had moved, the mechanical precision, the complete lack of wasted motion or energy. It spoke of training that went far beyond what you learned in basic military preparation. It spoke of experience that none of them could understand. Sarah stood there, mud dripping from her uniform, breathing steadily as she recovered from the run. She didn't celebrate, didn't gloat, didn't even seem particularly surprised by her performance. For her, this had just been another training exercise, another test to pass. Morrison studied her with new eyes. In 20 years of training soldiers, he had learned to recognize different types of recruits. There were the naturally gifted athletes who excel through raw talent. There were the hard workers who overcome limitations through determination and effort. And then, there were the rare ones, the ones who moved with a precision that only came from extensive, specialized training. "Where did you train before this?" he asked Sarah directly, his voice carrying none of the condescension that had been present earlier. Sarah met his gaze steadily. "Various places, drill sergeant," she replied in the regulation manner, giving nothing away. But Morrison's experienced eye had caught something else. During her run, when she had been climbing over the wall, her jacket had shifted slightly. For just a moment, he had glimpsed something sewn on the inside. A patch of some kind. It had been too quick to make out details, but there had been something familiar about the colors and shape. The rest of the training session continued, with other recruits attempting the course. But none of them came close to Sarah's time. Jake managed a respectable 11 minutes and 43 seconds, which would have been impressive if it hadn't been preceded by Sarah's run. Mike struggled through in just under 13 minutes, failing to make the required time and earning himself another attempt later in the day. As the recruits dispersed for the next training rotation, the whispers and jokes about Sarah had taken on a completely different tone. Instead of mockery, there was a grudging respect mixed with confusion and curiosity. Who was the small woman who had just outperformed all of them so decisively? Sarah gathered her gear and prepared to move to the next training station, but she could feel the weight of attention on her. The dynamics had shifted in a way that was both familiar and unwelcome. She had hoped to blend in, to complete her training without drawing attention to her background or capabilities. But, as she had learned many times before, sometimes your past has a way of catching up with you, no matter how hard you try to leave it behind. The patch hidden inside her jacket was more than just a piece of fabric. It was a symbol of a life she had left behind, of training and experiences that most people couldn't comprehend. As she walked toward the next training area, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that her carefully maintained anonymity was beginning to crack. The performance on the obstacle course had been necessary to avoid washing out of the program, but it had also revealed more about her capabilities than she had intended. Behind her, Morrison watched her go with growing curiosity. That glimpse of the patch nagged at him. There had been something about the colors, the design, that triggered a memory from his own extensive military experience. He made a mental note to pay closer attention to recruit Martinez in future training exercises. The following morning brought combat training, and Sarah found herself facing a completely different kind of challenge. The obstacle course had been about physical capability, something she could control through technique and conditioning. Combat training was about fighting other people, and that meant dealing with opponents who significantly outweighed and outreached her. Sergeant Davis, the hand-to-hand combat instructor, was a massive man who looked like he could bench press a small car. His scarred knuckles and crooked nose told the story of countless training sessions and real-world encounters. He approached combat instruction with the same intensity that a master chef might approach preparing a perfect meal, seeing each technique as an essential ingredient in creating a complete soldier. "Today we're working on basic defensive techniques," Davis announced to the assembled recruits. "In real combat situations, you won't always have weapons. You need to know how to protect yourself and neutralize threats using nothing but your body and your training. The recruits were paired off for sparring exercises. Sarah found herself matched against Rebecca Chen, one of the few other female recruits in the program. Rebecca was taller and heavier than Sarah, with the solid build of someone who had played college basketball. She seemed like a reasonable match based on size and gender, but Sarah could see the doubt in Rebecca's eyes. "Try not to hurt her too bad," Jake called out from across the training mat, earning laughs from several other recruits. "She might break." Sarah ignored the comment and focused on her opponent. Rebecca looked apologetic, clearly uncomfortable with the idea of fighting someone so much smaller than herself. "We don't have to go full intensity," Rebecca whispered as they moved into position. "I don't want to accidentally hurt you." The comment was meant kindly, but it stung more than the open mockery from the male recruits. Being underestimated by people trying to protect her was somehow worse than being dismissed by people who simply thought she was weak. "I'll be fine," Sarah replied quietly. "Just fight normally." Sergeant Davis demonstrated the basic defensive techniques they would be practicing: blocks, redirects, and simple takedown defenses. The movements looked straightforward when he demonstrated them, but Sarah knew that executing them under pressure against a resisting opponent was an entirely different challenge. "All right, begin with basic blocking drills," Davis instructed. "Attacker throws slow punches, defender practices the blocks we just covered." Rebecca started with gentle, telegraphed punches that gave Sarah plenty of time to execute the prescribed blocks. But something was wrong with the way Sarah moved. Her blocks were too fast, too precise. Instead of the awkward, learning movements that Davis expected from a new recruit, Sarah's hands moved with the fluid efficiency of someone who had practiced these techniques thousands of times. Davis noticed immediately. He had seen enough new recruits to know what learning looked like, and this wasn't it. Sarah's muscle memory was too well developed, her timing too perfect. She was going through the motions of learning techniques she clearly already knew. "Switch roles," Davis called out. "Martinez, you attack. Chen, you defend." Sarah hesitated for just a moment. Attacking meant she would have to hold back even more than she had been while defending. She would have to throw punches that looked real but contained none of the speed or power she was capable of generating. She started with slow, careful strikes that Rebecca could easily block. But even pulling her punches, Sarah's technique was flawless. Her footwork, her balance, the way she set up each strike, it all spoke of extensive training that went far beyond basic self-defense classes. "Faster," Davis instructed. "This isn't a dance. Put some pressure on your partner." Sarah increased her speed slightly, but she was walking a careful line. Too slow and she would look incompetent. Too fast and she would reveal more about her training than she wanted to. She threw a series of combination punches that were technically perfect but lacking any real intent to cause harm. Rebecca struggled to keep up with the increased pace. Despite Sarah's restraint, the smaller woman's attacks were coming faster and more precisely than Rebecca could handle. Her blocks were consistently a fraction of a second too late, and she found herself backing up under the pressure of Sarah's advance. "That's enough," Davis called out, and both women stopped immediately. He studied Sarah with the same intense focus that Morrison had shown after the obstacle course. "Martinez, where did you learn to fight?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. Sarah felt the attention of the entire training group focus on her. This was exactly the kind of scrutiny she had been hoping to avoid. "Just some self-defense classes, Sergeant," she replied in regulation fashion, meeting his gaze without flinching. Davis didn't buy it for a second. Self-defense classes didn't produce the kind of refined technique he had just witnessed. This was military-level training, or possibly something even more specialized. But before he could pursue the question further, a commotion at the far end of the training area drew his attention. Two recruits had gotten into an actual fight during their sparring session. Tom Bradley, a hothead from Chicago, had taken exception to what he perceived as excessive force from his partner and had responded with a real punch instead of a training technique. Now both men were rolling around on the mat, throwing actual punches and trying to hurt each other. "Break it up." Davis shouted, moving quickly to separate the fighters before someone got seriously injured. In the confusion of breaking up the real fight, Sarah's moment of scrutiny passed. But she noticed that several recruits had witnessed her sparring session with Rebecca, and word was beginning to spread. The whispers were starting again, but now they carried a different tone. Instead of mockery, there was curiosity and a growing respect. The rest of the morning passed with weapons training and marksmanship. This was another area where Sarah had to carefully calibrate her performance. She was naturally gifted with firearms, but her training had gone far beyond the basic rifle skills being taught to new recruits. At the shooting range, Sergeant Williams handed out standard M4 rifles and explained the basics of sight alignment and breathing control. For most recruits, this was their first real experience with military weapons, and it showed in their nervous handling and poor initial accuracy. Sarah approached the firing line with the same careful restraint she had shown during combat training. She needed to demonstrate competence without revealing expertise. The target was set at 100 yards, a reasonable distance for basic marksmanship training. Her first few shots were deliberately placed in the outer rings of the target, good enough to pass the qualification standards but not exceptional enough to draw unwanted attention. But, even holding back, her fundamentals were too solid. Her stance was perfect, her grip textbook, her breathing and trigger control automated through years of practice. Williams noticed the quality of her form immediately. "Martinez, have you shot before?" "Some hunting with my father, Sergeant," Sarah replied, sticking to a cover story she had prepared for exactly this situation. Williams nodded, but his experienced eye caught details that didn't quite fit the hunting story. Sarah's stance was too tactical, her grip too aggressive for someone whose experience came from hunting game animals. This was combat shooting technique, designed for engaging human targets under stress. But, before he could investigate further, Williams had to deal with Jake Thompson, who was struggling with basic weapon safety and had just flagged half the firing line with his muzzle. By the time that situation was resolved, the moment for questioning Sarah had passed. The pattern continued throughout the day. Every training exercise revealed more about Sarah's capabilities while simultaneously raising more questions about her background. She was clearly experienced in ways that her official record didn't explain, but she was being careful not to reveal too much at any one time. During the lunch break, Sarah found herself sitting alone at one of the mess hall tables. The social dynamics had become complicated since her performance on the obstacle course. She was no longer being openly mocked, but she wasn't being included either. She existed in a strange middle ground where people respected her abilities but remained suspicious of her background. Rebecca Chen approached with her lunch tray, looking uncertain. "Mind if I sit?" Sarah gestured to the empty chairs around her. "It's a free mess hall." Rebecca sat down and picked at her food for a moment before speaking. "That was some impressive stuff this morning. The obstacle course, the fighting training. You've obviously done this before." Sarah chewed her food slowly, considering how much to reveal. Rebecca seemed genuinely curious rather than suspicious, but Sarah had learned to be careful about who she trusted with information about her past. "Everyone has different backgrounds," Sarah replied neutrally. "Some people played sports, some worked construction, some did other things." "What other things did you do?" Rebecca pressed gently. Before Sarah could answer, Jake Thompson and Mike Davis approached their table. The two large men looked down at Sarah and Rebecca with expressions that were hard to read. "Mind if we join you?" Jake asked, but he was already sitting down before either woman could respond. Mike took the remaining chair and leaned forward on his elbows. "We've been talking," he said, "and we owe you an apology. We made some assumptions that were obviously wrong." Sarah looked between the two men, trying to gauge their sincerity. "It's fine," she said carefully. "Everyone makes mistakes." "No, it's not fine," Jake interrupted. "We were jerks. You proved yourself today, and we should have given you a chance from the beginning." There was an awkward silence as Sarah processed this unexpected apology. She had been prepared for continued hostility or grudging acceptance, but this direct acknowledgement of their poor behavior caught her off guard. "So where did you learn to move like that?"
Mike asked, his tone genuinely curious rather than challenging. That wasn't normal recruit stuff.
Sarah felt the familiar weight of scrutiny settling on her shoulders again. These questions were becoming more frequent and more direct. Soon it would become impossible to deflect them without outright lying, and she tried to avoid lying when possible.
I've always been athletic, she said, which was true as far as it went.
Some things just come naturally.
Jake shook his head. That wasn't natural talent. That was training. Serious training. The way you moved on that obstacle course, the fighting techniques, someone taught you that stuff.
Before Sarah could respond, a commotion at the entrance to the mess hall drew everyone's attention. A group of senior personnel had entered, their dress uniforms and bearing indicating significant rank. Among them was a tall man with silver eagles on his collar, a full colonel. The mess hall fell silent as every recruit and training instructor snapped to attention. The colonel surveyed the room with the calm confidence of someone accustomed to command, his gaze sweeping across the assembled personnel. Colonel James Harrison was a legend at Fort Benning. He had served multiple combat deployments, commanded special operations units, and was known throughout the Army for his expertise in unconventional warfare. His presence in the basic training mess hall was unusual enough to generate immediate attention and speculation. Harrison moved through the mess hall with purpose, acknowledging salutes and greetings from the training staff. But, as he passed near Sarah's table, something caught his eye. A small detail that most people would have missed entirely. Sarah had stood at attention with the rest of the recruits, but, in the process, her jacket had shifted slightly. For just a moment, the inside lining was visible, revealing a small patch sewn discreetly near the inner pocket. Colonel Harrison stopped mid-stride. The patch was small and dark, easily missed by casual observation. But Harrison's trained eye immediately recognized the distinctive design, a stylized wolf's head surrounded by crossed lightning bolts on a black background. It was a unit patch he hadn't seen in over 5 years, representing one of the military's most classified and elite special operations units. Harrison's mind raced as he processed what he was seeing. The unit that patch represented didn't officially exist according to most military records. Its members operated under deep cover, conducting missions that were never acknowledged and achieving objectives that were never publicly recognized. The patch belonged to a unit that had been disbanded 3 years ago following a classified incident that Harrison knew about only through his security clearance and need-to-know briefings. The members of that unit had been reassigned to other roles throughout the military, their service records sanitized to hide their involvement in operations that could never be revealed. And now one of those patches was sewn into the jacket of a recruit who was supposedly just starting her military career. Harrison looked at Sarah with new eyes, studying her face and bearing with the intensity of someone trying to solve a complex puzzle. She met his gaze steadily, but he could see the recognition in her eyes. She knew that he had seen the patch, and she knew that he understood its significance. The moment stretched out like a held breath. Around them, the mess hall remained frozen in attention, waiting for the colonel to continue his inspection. But Harrison was focused entirely on the small woman standing at attention near the center of the room. Finally, he spoke, his voice carrying clearly through the silent mess hall. As you were. The room relaxed slightly as people returned to their meals and conversations, but Harrison remained standing near Sarah's table. The conversation was about to take a turn that would change everything. Colonel Harrison remained standing near Sarah's table long after the rest of the mess hall had returned to normal activity. The other recruits, Jake, Mike, and Rebecca, sensed the tension in the air but couldn't understand its source. They sat frozen, unsure whether to continue eating or maintain some form of attention in the presence of such high-ranking officer. Sarah felt her carefully constructed facade beginning to crumble. 3 years of living under a new identity, of pretending to be just another young woman looking for direction in life, threatened to dissolve under the colonel's knowing gaze. She had known this moment might come eventually, but she had hoped to complete basic training and disappear into the anonymity of a regular military assignment. Recruit Martinez, Colonel Harrison said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. Would you join me for a brief discussion? It wasn't really a request. Sarah understood the nature of military courtesy well enough to know when she was being given a direct order disguised as a polite invitation. She stood from the table, acutely aware of the confused stares from her fellow recruits.
"Should we come with you?" Rebecca asked uncertainly, half rising from her chair. Harrison's gaze shifted to the other recruits with the kind of intensity that made even veteran soldiers uncomfortable.
"That won't be necessary," he said in a tone that made it clear the conversation would be private. Sarah followed the colonel out of the mess hall and down a corridor that led to the administrative offices. Her mind raced through possible explanations and cover stories, but she knew that any lie sophisticated enough to fool someone of Harrison's experience would only make things worse if he already knew the truth. Harrison led her to a small conference room and gestured for her to take a seat at the polished wooden table. He closed the door behind them and activated a small electronic device that would prevent any electronic surveillance of their conversation. The precaution told Sarah that he understood exactly how sensitive this discussion was likely to become. "Before we begin," Harrison said, settling into the chair across from her, "I want you to understand that this conversation is completely off the record. Nothing you say here will appear in any official report or documentation unless you specifically request it."
Sarah nodded, but remained silent.
Years of specialized training had taught her the value of letting the other person reveal how much they knew before committing to any particular version of events. Harrison studied her face for a long moment, then reached into his briefcase and withdrew a manila folder.
He placed it on the table between them but didn't open it immediately.
3 years ago, he began, there was an incident in Afghanistan. A special operations unit was conducting a classified mission when they were compromised. The details of what happened next are still buried under multiple layers of security classification, but the official story is that the entire unit was killed in action. He paused, watching Sarah's reaction. Her face remained carefully neutral, but he could see the slight tension around her eyes that indicated he was moving into dangerous territory. "The unofficial story," Harrison continued, "is that some members of that unit survived the incident but were extracted under circumstances that required their deaths to remain official. New identities were created, new lives established, and the survivors were quietly reassigned to other roles throughout the military structure." Sarah's hands remained steady on the table, but Harrison noticed the slight tightening of her fingers that suggested internal stress.
He was getting closer to something important. "The unit I'm referring to," he said quietly, "was designated Task Force Warhound.
They specialized in deep reconnaissance and direct action missions in denied territory. Their members were selected from the most elite units across all branches of the military and underwent training that most people would consider impossible." At the mention of Warhound, Sarah's carefully maintained composure slipped just enough for Harrison to notice. It was barely perceptible, a slight widening of the eyes, a momentary pause in breathing, but it confirmed what he had suspected since seeing the patch. Harrison opened the folder and withdrew a single photograph. It showed a group of 6 soldiers in specialized combat gear, their faces partially obscured by tactical equipment. The photo had been taken in what appeared to be a mountainous desert region, probably Afghanistan or Pakistan. "This photograph was taken 18 months before the official dissolution of Task Force Warhound," Harrison said, sliding the image across the table. "The mission details are classified, but I can tell you that this operation saved the lives of over 200 civilians and prevented what could have been a significant international incident." Sarah looked down at the photograph and felt a wave of emotion that she had been suppressing for 3 years.
She recognized every face in the image, could remember the exact circumstances under which it had been taken.
More painfully, she could remember what had happened to most of those people in the months that followed. "The woman in this photograph," Harrison continued, pointing to a figure whose face was partially visible beneath tactical gear, "bears a striking resemblance to a certain recruit who just completed an obstacle course in record time and demonstrated combat skills that far exceed anything taught in basic training." Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, then looked up to meet Harrison's gaze directly. The pretense had become pointless, and continuing to lie would only insult the intelligence of someone who clearly already knew the truth. "Her name was Staff Sergeant Maria Santos," Sarah said quietly. "She died in Afghanistan 3 years ago, along with the rest of her unit."
Harrison nodded slowly. "And Sarah Martinez?"
is trying to build a new life with the skills she learned in her previous one.
The admission hung in the air between them like a confession at trial.
Harrison leaned back in his chair, processing the confirmation of what he had suspected since seeing the Warhound patch. The official records show that Task Force Warhound was conducting a routine reconnaissance mission when they were ambushed by a superior force, Harrison said. All 6 team members were listed as killed in action, and their bodies were supposedly recovered and returned to their families for burial.
Sarah's jaw tightened at the mention of the official story.
The official records are incomplete, she said carefully.
I assumed as much, Harrison replied. Would you be willing to tell me what really happened?
Sarah was quiet for a long moment, wrestling with decisions about trust and security that had been drilled into her through years of classified operations.
Finally, she began to speak.
We were conducting deep reconnaissance on a suspected weapons smuggling route through the Hindu Kush Mountains. The intelligence was good, but incomplete. What we found was bigger than anyone expected, not just weapons, but a major staging area for coordinated attacks on coalition forces. She paused, remembering details that she had tried to suppress for 3 years.
The problem was that we had stumbled into something that involved people who weren't supposed to be there.
American contractors, foreign intelligence operatives, local officials who were supposed to be allies. The weapons weren't just being smuggled to insurgents, they were being provided to them by people who had a financial interest in keeping the conflict going. Harrison's expression remained neutral, but Sarah could see that this information wasn't completely surprising to him. The ugly realities of modern warfare often involved complications that didn't fit neatly into official narratives. We called in the intelligence and requested extraction, Sarah continued. But, instead of support, we found ourselves being hunted by people who knew our exact location and capabilities.
Someone had provided detailed information about our mission to the wrong people. A betrayal from within, Harrison said grimly.
More than that, Sarah replied.
The people hunting us weren't just local fighters.
They were professionals, well-equipped and well-informed. They knew our protocols, our equipment, our likely escape routes.
Someone with access to classified information had set us up.
Harrison absorbed this information, fitting it into his understanding of the geopolitical complexities that surrounded military operations in Afghanistan. The involvement of contractors and intelligence operatives in weapons smuggling wasn't uncommon, but the systematic targeting of an elite special operations unit suggested something more organized and dangerous.
How did you survive when the others didn't? Harrison asked gently.
Sarah's composure finally cracked slightly, and Harrison could see the pain that she had been carrying for 3 years. When she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. Because I was the one who was supposed to die first, she said. The ambush was designed to take out our leadership and communications before targeting the rest of the team. But our team leader, Captain Williams, realized what was happening and put himself in my position. He died in the first few seconds of the attack, along with our medic and our communications specialist. She took a shaky breath before continuing. The surviving 3 of us managed to break contact and evade capture for 6 days. We had no communications, minimal supplies, and were being hunted by forces that seemed to know our every move. On the 6th day, we were cornered in a canyon with no escape routes. Harrison waited patiently as Sarah gathered herself to continue the most difficult part of her story. Rodriguez and Chin decided that the only way any of us would survive was if someone stayed behind to delay the pursuit while the others escaped. They volunteered to be that delaying force, and they ordered me to get out and report what we had discovered. The raw pain in Sarah's voice made it clear that this decision still haunted her. Survivor's guilt was common among special operations veterans, but Harrison could see that Sarah's case was particularly severe. I spent 4 more days evading capture before finally reaching a coalition checkpoint, Sarah continued. By then, the official story was already being written. The site where my teammates died had been sanitized, our equipment recovered or destroyed, and any evidence of the larger conspiracy had been eliminated. And you were debriefed by people who already knew what story they wanted to tell, Harrison guessed.
Sarah nodded.
I was informed that reporting the full truth would compromise ongoing operations and endanger other personnel. I was offered a choice: accept the official version of events and receive a new identity and assignment, or insist on a full investigation and risk court-martial for discussing classified operations.
Harrison understood the impossible position Sarah had been placed in.
The military's need to protect ongoing operations often conflicted with individual soldiers' desire for truth and justice. In cases involving special operations and classified activities, the needs of the larger mission typically took precedence over personal considerations. So Maria Santos died with the rest of her team, Harrison said, and Sarah Martinez was born to take her place.
More or less, Sarah confirmed.
I was given a new identity, a fabricated background, and orders to complete basic training before being assigned to a regular unit where my specialized skills would be wasted but my knowledge would be contained. Harrison closed the folder and leaned back in his chair, processing everything Sarah had told him. Her story explained not only her exceptional performance during training exercises but also the careful way she had been holding back to avoid drawing attention to herself.
The question now, Harrison said, is what happens next?
Sarah looked up at him with a mixture of hope and resignation. She had lived for 3 years knowing that her past could catch up with her at any moment, and now that moment had arrived. The question was whether Colonel Harrison represented salvation or the end of her carefully constructed new life. That depends, Sarah said carefully, on whether you're here as a friend or as someone sent to tie up loose ends. Harrison's expression revealed nothing about his intentions, but he reached into his briefcase again and withdrew a second folder, this one marked with security classifications that Sarah recognized. Actually, he said, placing the folder on the table, I'm here with a proposition. Colonel Harrison opened the classified folder and spread several documents across the table. Sarah recognized the format immediately: operational briefings, target assessments, and mission parameters that were familiar from her previous life. Her pulse quickened as she realized that Harrison wasn't here to end her new life, but potentially to offer her a return to her old one. 6 months ago, Harrison began, intelligence assets began reporting unusual activity in several regions where Task Force Warhound had previously operated. Weapon smuggling networks that should have been disrupted by your team's final mission were not only still operational, but had actually expanded their capabilities.
He pointed to a satellite photograph showing a compound in what appeared to be mountainous terrain. This facility didn't exist 3 years ago.
Neither did this one, or this one, he said, indicating additional images. Someone has been using the intelligence gathered from your team's mission to expand operations rather than shut them down.
Sarah studied the photographs with growing alarm.
These weren't just smuggling waypoints, they were sophisticated logistical hubs capable of supporting large-scale operations. The level of organization and resources required to build these facilities suggested involvement from major players with substantial financial backing. We believe, Harrison continued, that the same people responsible for the betrayal of your team are now using the intelligence you gathered to build a network that threatens stability throughout the region.
They've essentially turned your sacrifice into their business plan. The anger that Sarah felt at this revelation was immediate and intense.
Her teammates had died trying to disrupt these networks, and now their deaths were being used to make those same networks more efficient and profitable.
What does this have to do with me? Sarah asked, though she was beginning to suspect she knew the answer. Harrison pulled out another document, a detailed dossier on a man whose photograph Sarah recognized immediately. Vincent Kozlov, a former Spetsnaz operator who had transitioned into private military contracting after the fall of the Soviet Union.
He had been one of the primary targets of Task Force Warhound's final mission. Kozlov survived the disruption of his original network and has spent the past 3 years building something much larger and more dangerous, Harrison explained. But he made one critical mistake. He's been recruiting former special operations personnel from various armies, and one of his recent acquisitions is someone who was present during your team's final mission.
Sarah's eyes widened as she processed the implications.
Someone with direct knowledge of what had happened to her team was now working for the person they had been trying to stop.
We need someone who can infiltrate this network, Harrison continued.
Someone with the skills to operate in a hostile environment, gather intelligence, and potentially take direct action if necessary.
Someone who has personal motivation to see this mission succeed. He leaned forward across the table. We need someone who officially doesn't exist.
Sarah stared at the documents spread across the table, her mind racing through the implications of what Harrison was proposing. After 3 years of trying to build a normal life, she was being offered a chance to return to the world she had left behind.
But, this time, it would be personal. This would be completely unofficial, Harrison said. No government acknowledgement, no official support, no backup if things go wrong. If you're captured or killed, Sarah Martinez simply disappears and Maria Santos remains dead. What about my current assignment? Sarah asked.
I'm supposed to complete basic training and report to a regular unit. Harrison smiled grimly.
According to the records, Sarah Martinez will wash out of basic training in 2 weeks due to inability to meet physical standards.
She'll receive an honorable discharge and disappear from military records entirely.
The irony wasn't lost on Sarah.
After proving herself capable of exceeding every standard the military could set, she would officially fail for being too weak to serve. The mission parameters would be similar to your previous work with Warhound, Harrison continued. Deep cover infiltration, intelligence gathering, and, if the opportunity presents itself, direct action against high-value targets.
The difference is that this time, you'll have the advantage of being officially dead.
Sarah picked up one of the photographs again, studying the face of Vincent Kozlov. She remembered the intelligence briefings about him from 3 years ago, remembered the discussions about how his network was responsible for weapons that had killed American soldiers and coalition personnel. What makes you think I can succeed where an entire task force failed? She asked. Because you're not going in as part of a military unit that can be betrayed by insider information, Harrison replied. You're going in as a freelancer looking for work. Someone with exactly the kind of background and skills that Kozlov's organization needs.
He pulled out another document showing Sarah's fabricated background for the mission.
Elena Volkov, former Russian military, discharged for disciplinary issues. Specialized training in reconnaissance and direct action, available for private contract work. The kind of person who might have reasons to work against American interests. Sarah studied the false identity with professional interest. It was sophisticated enough to stand up to significant scrutiny, with documentation that would trace back to legitimate sources if investigated.
The best part, Harrison added, is that Elena Volkov's background includes service in units that would have trained alongside some of the people now working for Kozlov.
You'll be able to speak their language, literally and figuratively.
Sarah felt a familiar surge of adrenaline that she hadn't experienced in 3 years.
This was the kind of mission that Task Force Warhound had been created for: complex, dangerous, and critical to national security interests. But there were personal considerations that made this different from any mission she had undertaken before.
What about my life here? She asked.
The identity I've built, the relationships I've formed?
Harrison's expression softened slightly. That's a choice only you can make.
If you accept this mission, Sarah Martinez disappears forever. There's no coming back from this kind of deep cover assignment. Sarah thought about Rebecca, Jake, and Mike, people who had started as antagonists but were becoming friends. She thought about the normal life she had been trying to build, the possibility of relationships and experiences that didn't involve violence and deception. But she also thought about Rodriguez and Chen dying in a canyon in Afghanistan while she escaped. She thought about Captain Williams dying in her place during an ambush that had been orchestrated by the same people who were now profiting from his sacrifice. How much time do I have to decide? She asked. The window for infiltration closes in 2 weeks, Harrison replied. Kozlov's organization is recruiting for a major operation, and we need someone in place before it begins.
Sarah nodded, understanding the urgency. Special operations missions often depended on narrow windows of opportunity that couldn't be postponed or delayed.
I need to think about this, she said finally.
Harrison began gathering the documents back into their folders. I understand. This isn't a decision to be made lightly.
He paused and looked directly at her. But I will say this, you're the only person we know of who has both the skills and the motivation to make this mission succeed.
Without your involvement, a lot of good people are going to die. As Harrison prepared to leave, Sarah stopped him with a question. How did you know to look for me here? How did you even know I was alive?
Harrison smiled for the first time during their conversation. A few months ago, we started hearing rumors about unusual performance reports from various basic training installations.
Recruits who were demonstrating skills far beyond what their backgrounds should have provided.
When we investigated, we found several people who matched the profile of former Special Operations personnel operating under new identities. He stood and adjusted his uniform jacket. You're not the only survivor who was given a new life, but you are the only one we need for this particular mission. Sarah felt a surge of hope at the revelation that other members of the Special Operations community had survived their official deaths and were building new lives throughout the military. The decision is yours, Harrison said as he moved toward the door. But, if you choose to accept this mission, meet me at these coordinates tomorrow night at 2200 hours. He handed her a small piece of paper with GPS coordinates written on it. After Harrison left, Sarah sat alone in the conference room for a long time, staring at the coordinates and wrestling with the most difficult decision of her life. She could continue building the normal existence she had been pursuing for 3 years, or she could return to the dangerous world she had tried to leave behind. The choice should have been easy. She had already sacrificed enough for her country, already paid a price that most people couldn't imagine. She deserved the chance to live a peaceful life without the constant threat of violence and betrayal. But, as she sat in the quiet conference room, Sarah realized that she had been living a lie for 3 years. Not just the lie of her identity, but the lie that she could be satisfied with a normal existence after everything she had experienced. The carefully constructed life of Sarah Martinez felt hollow compared to the sense of purpose she had felt as Maria Santos. She made her decision. The next evening, Sarah stood in the darkness at the coordinates Harrison had provided, wearing civilian clothes and carrying a small bag with the few personal possessions she couldn't leave behind. The location was a remote area outside the base, accessible only by a dirt road that wound through pine forests. At exactly 2200 hours, headlights appeared through the trees. A black SUV approached and stopped 20 feet from where Sarah waited. Colonel Harrison stepped out of the passenger seat, followed by 2 other people in civilian clothes whom Sarah didn't recognize. "You came," Harrison said, though his tone suggested he wasn't surprised. "I couldn't let my teammates' deaths continue to be used against everything they died for," Sarah replied. Harrison nodded and gestured toward the SUV. "Then, let's get started. Elena Volkov has a plane to catch." As Sarah climbed into the vehicle, she felt the familiar weight of a mission settling on her shoulders. The next few months would be dangerous, possibly fatal, and would require her to become someone else entirely. But, for the first time in 3 years, she felt like she was exactly where she belonged. The SUV disappeared into the darkness, carrying Sarah Martinez away from the normal life she had tried to build and toward the dangerous world where Maria Santos had always truly belonged. Behind them, Fort Benning continued its endless cycle of training new soldiers, but none of the remaining recruits would ever know that one of their classmates had just volunteered for the most dangerous mission of her life. In the morning, the training cadre would announce that recruit Martinez had washed out of the program due to inability to meet basic standards. Her fellow recruits would be shocked and confused, remembering her exceptional performance in every training exercise. But Sarah wouldn't be there to see their reactions. By then, she would be halfway around the world, preparing to become Elena Volkov and infiltrate an organization that had already killed her once. This time, she was determined to make sure they didn't get a second chance.